Maria Collins, David Collins, and Father Michael Donovan, three names that began as ordinary lives in a quiet town, but together they wove a story of forbidden love, shattered vows, and a deadly betrayal that ended with blood in the rain and secrets buried in the dark. Maria Collins was the kind of woman neighbors described as polite and pleasant, someone who waved when she collected her mail and attended every Sunday service with her husband and children. On the outside, her life looked secure, even inviolable. She had a hard-working husband, David, two healthy children, and a neatly kept home on a quiet suburban street. But inside, Maria felt a gnawing emptiness. She moved through her days like clockwork, her schedule predictable, her role defined by cooking, cleaning, and waiting for David to come home from his long hours at the accounting firm. The routine that once comforted her now felt like a cage, and she found herself restless, searching for something she couldn't name. It was during one of these Sunday mornings that she first noticed Father Michael Donovan in a way she never had before. He was younger than most priests, with sharp features and a voice that seemed to settle a crowd. His sermons had a calm authority, but what stood out to Maria was how personal they felt, as though he was speaking directly to her. He looked at her longer than others, or at least she believed he did, and the attention gave her a quiet thrill. For weeks she brushed it off, convincing herself that it was nothing, that he was just doing his duty as a parish priest. But when their paths crossed after Mass and he asked about her family, something inside her shifted. It was the first time in years that she felt truly seen. Their conversations began simply, short exchanges by the church doors or in the parish hall. Maria found herself lingering, waiting for a chance to catch his eye. Soon she was volunteering for small church events just to be near him. To others it seemed like ordinary devotion, but for Maria it was more. Father Michael's presence filled a void that David, distracted by work and his own exhaustion, didn't even notice. She began dressing more carefully for Mass, applying lipstick and perfume. Tiny changes meant only for one person to notice. As summer stretched on, those small moments turned into longer talks. He asked about her childhood, her dreams, her worries. She confessed her loneliness without ever naming it as such, and he listened without judgment. The more she spoke, the more she convinced herself that what they had was unique, something that went beyond the boundaries of duty and faith. She told herself that she wasn't doing anything wrong, that she was simply connecting with someone who understood her in ways her husband no longer did. But temptation grows slowly, and soon it became harder to ignore the weight of what was forming between them. The first time they crossed the line, Maria felt a rush of fear and exhilaration so strong she could barely breathe. It was not planned, not something she had consciously decided. One moment she was standing too close, the next she was swept into a secret she knew she could never tell. That night she returned home to her family with trembling hands, replaying every second in her mind, torn between guilt and an intoxicating sense of being alive again. The quiet suburban house where she had once felt trapped suddenly seemed like a stage where she had to perform, pretending nothing had changed while inside she carried a dangerous secret. Days became weeks, and Maria found herself slipping deeper into the affair. She lied about errands, stretched the truth about where she had been, and lived for the moments when she could escape the eyes of her husband and children. With every lie she told, her heart raced, but the fear only seemed to heighten the thrill. Father Michael, bound by vows he had sworn before God, was risking everything alongside her. That fact alone made it feel like their love was forbidden and powerful, as if the secrecy itself proved it was real. Maria convinced herself she deserved this happiness, even if it came wrapped in sin. She told herself that she had given years of loyalty and sacrifice to her husband, that she had been a faithful wife and a good mother. Now, finally, she had something of her own, but beneath those justifications lay a truth she could not face. Every step deeper into the affair brought her closer to a breaking point. The town around her remained unaware, the neighbors still waving, the parish still praising Father Michael's sermons. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet in the shadows, a dangerous storm was gathering. Every hidden glance and whispered meeting added fuel to a fire that could not burn in secret forever. Maria thought she was chasing love, but what she was really awakening was a chain of events that would spiral far beyond her control, leading not to freedom but to tragedy. The affair quickly became the center of Maria's life, overshadowing everything else. She woke each morning with a mix of dread and excitement, her thoughts consumed by how she could see Father Michael again without raising suspicion. Her errands grew longer, her explanations thinner, but she convinced herself that David was too busy with his work to notice. At first that seemed true. He came home late most nights, exhausted and distracted, barely acknowledging her restlessness. But Maria underestimated him. Her visits with Michael were carefully planned, tucked into the hidden corners of the week. They met at motels on the outskirts of town, where no one knew them and the staff didn't ask questions. She began memorizing back roads to avoid running into familiar faces. Sometimes, when he couldn't leave the parish, they risked everything by meeting in the rectory or even in the darkened church after hours. Each meeting was a collision of fear and desire, leaving Maria shaky and breathless. She knew it couldn't last, yet she couldn't let go. The danger of being caught only made it more irresistible. David noticed the changes before Maria realized she was giving herself away. Her phone was always within reach, and she grew jumpy whenever he entered the room. She had new clothes she claimed were bought on sale, and perfume that lingered when she returned from supposed shopping trips. Small cracks in her story became larger with time. David tried to ignore them at first, telling himself his wife would never betray him. But as the months passed, his suspicions hardened into certainty. One evening, while Maria was in the shower, David checked her purse and found a folded receipt from a roadside motel. The date and time were impossible to explain away. His hands shook as he read it, a mix of rage and humiliation twisting inside him. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he slipped the receipt back into place and began quietly watching her. Every phone call, every sudden errand, every unexplained delay became a piece of evidence. His anger grew each day he confirmed what he already knew. Meanwhile, Maria and Michael carried on, blind to the storm brewing. To him, the affair was a dangerous temptation that both thrilled and terrified him. He told himself he could control it, that no one would ever find out. But whispers had already begun to stir within the parish. Ruth Miller, a devoted church member who attended every service, had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She noticed the way Maria lingered near the rectory, how her car appeared outside late at night. She mentioned it to a friend in passing, and soon the whispers spread. In a small town, secrets never stayed hidden for long. Michael felt the weight of those murmurs pressing down on him. Parishioners who once greeted him warmly now exchanged uneasy looks. He knew he was taking a risk each time he met Maria, but he couldn't pull away. She gave him a sense of intimacy he had denied himself for years. For Maria, it was more than intimacy. It was a lifeline. She clung to him, convinced that what they had was love strong enough to overcome the rules of the church, the expectations of the town, and the vows he had sworn. But as her feelings deepened, so did her recklessness. She called him more often, left the house at odd hours, and began pressing him for more time together. For the first time, their secret was no longer carefully hidden but carelessly flaunted, at least to those who cared enough to look. And David was watching closer than anyone. He followed her one afternoon when she claimed she was meeting a friend for coffee. He trailed her car at a distance, his pulse racing, until he saw her pull into the parking lot of a small motel. Minutes later, Michael arrived. David sat in his car for hours, the image of his wife and the priest entering that room burned into his mind. When they finally emerged, laughing quietly, David gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. From that moment, his anger was no longer just suspicion, it was proof. He began documenting everything, saving receipts, noting times, even taking photographs. The humiliation of being betrayed was unbearable, but what fueled him most was the thought of others finding out. He imagined the whispers behind his back, the pitting looks, the judgment. To him, Maria and Michael weren't just breaking their vows to each other and the church, they were destroying him. Maria, wrapped in her secret world, didn't sense the danger closing in. She believed she was clever enough to keep the affair hidden, unaware that her husband now carried a growing file of evidence. She thought the only threat came from gossiping parishioners, but the real danger was sitting across from her at the dinner table every night, silently planning his next move. David's silence became more dangerous than any outburst. He no longer questioned Maria about her sudden absences or her coldness at home. Instead, he let her believe she was still fooling him. Each evening, while she prepared dinner and tried to act like nothing was wrong, he studied her with quiet intensity. Maria mistook his calm for indifference, not realizing it was the calm of a man plotting in secret. Maria, meanwhile, slipped deeper into her obsession with Father Michael. She was no longer content with stolen hours in motel rooms or whispered phone calls. She wanted permanence, a future that belonged only to them. The idea of returning to her life with David felt unbearable. She began pushing Michael to make a choice, urging him to leave the church, abandon his vows, and start a new life with her. Her words carried desperation, but also expectation. To her, the affair was no longer a thrill, it was salvation. For Michael, the pressure was suffocating. He had entered the relationship believing it was a controlled indulgence, something he could keep contained in the shadows. But Maria's demands forced him to confront the reality of his choices. If he left the priesthood, he would face disgrace, scandal, and the loss of the only identity he had ever known. The parish already felt the shift in him. His sermons lacked their usual conviction, and his confessions grew shorter, distracted. He knew people were talking. Ruth Miller's watchful eyes had already caught too much, and her whispers traveled through the pews faster than wildfire. The tension between Maria and Michael grew sharper. He resisted her pleas, insisting their love had to remain hidden, but Maria refused to accept a half-life of secrecy. Each time he tried to slow things down, she tightened her hold on him. She told herself that if she pushed hard enough, he would eventually choose her. What she didn't realize was that her insistence was driving him further into fear and guilt. David's investigation of their affair became his obsession. He began arriving home earlier, carefully checking Maria's excuses against her actual movements. He monitored her calls and scrolled through her messages late at night while she slept. His file of evidence thickened: receipts, notes of times and dates, photographs taken from a distance. With each piece of proof, the rage inside him burned hotter. He told himself he would confront her when the moment was right, but part of him already knew confrontation would not be enough. The breaking point came when David captured undeniable evidence. One autumn afternoon, he followed Maria again, this time with a small camera he had borrowed from a colleague. He watched as she pulled into the same roadside motel, watched as Michael's car pulled up minutes later, and waited with the patience of a hunter. Hours later, he snapped the picture that sealed her fate: Maria and Father Michael leaving together, their hands brushing, their smiles revealing intimacy. That photograph became the final spark. At home, David stared at the image for hours, the edges of the photo crumpling in his fists. It wasn't just proof of betrayal, it was proof of his humiliation. He imagined the laughter of others if they ever found out, the collapse of his reputation in the community, the pity in the eyes of his children. To him, Maria and Michael hadn't just broken their vows, they had destroyed his life, his pride, and his identity. While David's fury hardened into a dangerous plan, Maria remained lost in her fantasy. She still pressed Michael to leave the priesthood, her voice filled with urgency. She painted pictures of a new life, one where they lived openly, free from secrecy and fear. Michael resisted, warning her of the risks, but he was trapped too deeply to walk away. Their meetings grew more frantic, more desperate, as if both of them knew time was running out. David's final discovery came when he followed Maria to the rectory one evening. Hidden in the shadows, he watched as she entered through the back door. An hour later, he saw her with Michael through the narrow crack of a curtain. The sight was worse than anything he had imagined. His wife, the mother of his children, in the arms of the priest who was supposed to represent trust, faith, and morality. David felt something inside him snap. He returned home that night with his jaw clenched, his mind spiraling. There would be no confrontation filled with words, no begging for truth or apologies. The betrayal had carved too deep a wound, and in his eyes, there was only one way to reclaim his dignity. Maria had mistaken his silence for weakness, but what she didn't realize was that he had already made his decision. The quiet suburban town that looked so peaceful from the outside was about to become the stage for an eruption of violence. What had started as a hidden romance was now a fuse burning toward disaster, and all three of them were standing far too close to the fire. The storm that had been brewing in silence finally broke on a cold November night. Rain lashed against the windows of the Collins home as David sat in the darkened living room, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He knew where Maria was, and he knew she wasn't running errands. Every excuse she had given him had become predictable, every lie rehearsed. This time he didn't just watch from a distance. He was ready to act. The evidence he had gathered was enough to destroy both Maria and Father Michael in the eyes of the community. But humiliation wasn't enough anymore. The betrayal had burned too deep. He needed something final, something that couldn't be undone. Maria drove to the rectory that evening, unaware that her husband was following at a careful distance. She parked her car in the shadow of the church and slipped inside, her umbrella dripping rain onto the steps. The street was empty, the storm ensuring no one lingered outside. David waited in his car, the windshield wipers beating in rhythm with his racing pulse. He imagined what was happening inside, and each thought fueled the rage twisting in his chest. An hour passed before the door of the rectory opened again. Maria emerged, her coat pulled tightly around her, followed by Father Michael. He held an umbrella over both of them, a small gesture of intimacy that ignited David's fury. They laughed quietly as they hurried across the parking lot, their closeness undeniable even in the pouring rain. It was then that David stepped out of the shadows. The confrontation erupted without warning. David's voice cut through the storm, sharp and filled with venom. Maria froze, her face pale as she realized what was happening. Michael tried to speak, but David's rage was unstoppable. He lunged forward, his fists clenched, years of betrayal exploding in a single moment. The priest attempted to defend himself, but he was no match for the fury of a man who felt everything he had ever built slipping away. The struggle was brutal. The rain-soaked pavement became slick as the two men grappled, their shouts drowned out by thunder. Maria screamed for them to stop, her voice breaking, but neither man listened. David struck Michael again and again, his anger turning into something primal, something beyond reason. The priest fell hard against the ground, his head striking the curb. Blood mingled with rainwater, spreading in dark rivulets across the pavement. For a moment silence hung heavy. Maria stared at Michael's body, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder, but his chest no longer rose and fell. The man she had once believed would save her from her unhappiness now lay lifeless, the storm washing over him as though the night itself wanted to erase what had happened. David stood motionless, his chest heaving, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. There was no undoing it, no way to return to the life they once had. Maria turned toward him, her face a mask of terror, but instead of calling the police, she made a desperate choice. In that moment, she saw the truth. If the body was found, the scandal would consume her, her children, and everything she had left. The affair would be exposed, and her reputation destroyed. She begged David not to let the world find out, convincing him that hiding the body was their only option. Together under the cover of the storm, they dragged Michael's lifeless form to David's car. The rain masked the sound of their struggle, the empty street providing them cover. Every second felt like an eternity as they heaved the priest into the trunk, Maria's hands trembling as she slammed it shut. They drove in silence, the only sound the relentless drumming of rain against the roof. On the outskirts of town, near a wooded clearing few people visited, David pulled off the road. They worked quickly, digging into the wet earth with shovels kept in the trunk for yard work. The mud clung to their clothes, their hands blistered, but they didn't stop until the shallow grave was ready. They lowered Michael into the ground, his face illuminated briefly by lightning before being covered forever by dirt and debris. When the grave was filled, they stood in silence, soaked and shivering, staring at the mound of earth that held their darkest secret. Driving back into town, Maria tried to steady her breathing, but her mind raced. She thought of her children asleep in their beds, of the neighbors who would never imagine what she had just done, of the parishioners who would wonder why their priest had suddenly vanished. She told herself they could keep the secret, that no one would ever connect them to his disappearance. David gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw set, already consumed by the reality that their lives would never be the same. The storm passed by dawn, leaving behind a washed, clean town unaware of the crime committed in its shadows. But secrets like theirs were not meant to stay buried. The grave they had dug was shallow in more ways than one, and it was only a matter of time before the truth clawed its way back to the surface. The disappearance of Father Michael Donovan sent shockwaves through the small suburban town. At first, the church released a vague statement, claiming he had taken a sudden leave of absence for personal reasons. Parishioners nodded politely, but beneath their hushed prayers, whispers began to spread. A priest so devoted, so present in every mass and confession, did not simply vanish without warning. Ruth Miller, whose watchful eyes had already noted Maria's suspicious visits to the rectory, wasted no time sharing her theories. Her voice reached the ears of many, and soon the name of Maria Collins was quietly tied to the mystery. Maria tried to carry on with her daily routine, but every step felt heavy, every glance from her neighbors seemed loaded with suspicion. She forced herself to smile at her children, to wave at passing cars, but inside she was unraveling at night. She lay awake beside David, replaying the stormy night in her mind. The sound of rain pounding against the pavement, the sight of Michael's lifeless body, the feel of mud clinging to her hands, these memories refused to fade. She wanted to believe the secret was safe, buried with the man who had once made her feel alive. But her nerves betrayed her. She jumped at sudden knocks on the door and avoided eye contact with friends. David noticed her unraveling but said nothing. He was colder now, hardened, and his silence was its own punishment. Detectives were soon drawn into the case when parish members insisted on answers. They began by retracing Father Michael's last known movements, interviewing church staff, volunteers, and members of the congregation. Maria was questioned early, and though she denied knowing anything, her unease was difficult to hide. Her story about running errands on the night Michael vanished didn't align with the timeline. David's temper during his own questioning raised further suspicion. Detectives took note, and the Collins family quickly shifted from ordinary parishioners to key figures in the investigation. The first crack came when investigators searched David's car. Though he had tried to clean it thoroughly, faint traces of blood remained, hidden in the seams of the trunk lining. Forensic analysis confirmed it was human, and though they didn't yet have proof it belonged to Michael, the discovery tightened the net around the Collinses. Maria's world shrank in an instant. Every time she left the house, she felt eyes on her, Every police car she passed made her stomach twist. Weeks later, the case took a grim turn when two hunters stumbled upon disturbed soil in the wooded clearing outside town. The ground looked unnatural, a patch of earth uneven and partially exposed by weather. When police arrived and dug, they found the remains of Father Michael. His clerical collar still clung to the tattered clothing, a haunting reminder of the life he once led. The town erupted in grief and outrage. Parishioners lit candles, prayed in silence, and demanded justice. The whispers turned into accusations and suspicion settled firmly on Maria and David. The evidence mounted quickly. Phone records revealed Maria's frequent calls to Michael. Witnesses spoke of seeing her car outside the rectory late at night. The blood in David's car tied him to the burial site. When detectives confronted Maria with the details, her composure crumbled. She confessed to helping David hide the body, though she insisted she hadn't taken part in the killing. David, however, remained unyielding, refusing to admit guilt, claiming it had been self-defense. But the photographs he had taken, the motel receipts, and Maria's testimony painted a damning picture. The trial was a spectacle. Neighbors who had once admired the Collins family filled the courtroom, eager to hear the sordid details. Journalists reported every word, framing the case as a tragic mix of love, betrayal, and faith gone wrong. The prosecution described David as a man consumed by jealousy and rage, who had taken the life of a priest in a fit of violence. Maria was portrayed as a woman driven by passion, who crossed boundaries and then helped conceal a crime. The defense tried to argue that David acted in a moment of uncontrollable despair, but the jury saw a man who had planned, followed, and executed his revenge. In the end, David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict silenced the courtroom, the weight of justice finally settling over the tragedy. Maria received a lesser sentence for her role in the cover-up, but her punishment was heavy in other ways. She lost her children to the custody of relatives, lost her home, and lost the man she had believed was her escape. In prison, she carried the double burden of grief and guilt, haunted by the choices that had destroyed everything she once knew. The town never forgot the scandal. The church struggled to rebuild trust. The Collins children grew up under the shadow of their parents' crimes, and the grave in the woods became a place whispered about, but rarely visited. What began with a housewife's longing for affection and a priest's broken vows ended in betrayal, violence, and death. The affair that once felt like a secret paradise had instead opened a door to ruin, proving that some desires, once unleashed, carry a cost far greater than anyone can bear.